Welcome to history's chronicles of horror. In the vast, snow-choked expanse of 18th century Russia, a story was whispered, a tale that curdled the blood and froze the soul. It spoke of a darkness that had taken root in the heart of the aristocracy, a rot that festered behind the gilded facade of a grand Moscow estate. This was not a story of some beast from folklore, a creature of fang and claw that stalked the shadowed forests. The monster in this tale was a woman, a countess, one of the wealthiest and most well-connected figures in the empire. She walked in daylight, dressed in shimmering silks, and was renowned for her almost fanatical piety. To the world, Countess Darya Saltykova was a paragon of virtue, a tragic young widow whose public life was a performance of impeccable grace and religious devotion. Her generous donations to the church were the talk of Moscow, her pilgrimages to holy shrines a testament to her faith. She was a pillar of the community, a respected noblewoman with friends in the highest echelons of power, her influence reaching into the very heart of the imperial court. But beyond the velvet curtains and behind the locked doors of her home, a different truth festered. Within those walls, the pious widow was a sadist. The respectable noblewoman was a systematic torturer. A dark secret was being kept, written in the blood and tears of the helpless souls she owned. This is the true story of how one of Russia's most privileged women descended into a madness so profound she would become the nation's most monstrous serial killer. It is the story of a home transformed into a private torture chamber, a place where the slightest perceived mistake was met with meticulous, imaginative, and unspeakable brutality. And most disturbingly, it is the story of a corrupt, dehumanizing system that didn't just allow her to get away with murder for years, but actively conspired to protect her, silencing the cries of her victims time and time again. To understand the monster, you must first understand the terrifying world that built her, piece by bloody piece. To truly comprehend the chilling saga of Darya Saltykova, we must first peel back the layers of time and descend into the brutal reality of 18th century Imperial Russia. It was an era of paradox, a world of almost unimaginable opulence built upon a foundation of staggering, soul-crushing cruelty. On one hand, the Russian Empire was a dazzling global power, its court a spectacle of wealth and sophistication. On the other, its strength was drawn from a system of human bondage so complete, so medieval in its barbarity, that it is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp the institution of serfdom. For many of us, the word serf conjures images of peasants tied to the land. But in the Russia of the 1700s, it was something far more sinister. It was, in every meaningful way, slavery. The vast, overwhelming majority of the Russian population were not considered citizens with rights. They were property, chattel, items to be listed in a ledger alongside livestock and furniture. They were legally, spiritually, and physically bound to the patch of earth where they were born, and by extension, they were bound to the will of the noblemen who owned that land. This brutal reality had been codified into law. The Sobornoye Yelazny, a legal code from 1649, had stripped them of their last vestiges of freedom, cementing their status as human property. It became a criminal offense for a serf to flee their master, and this law granted landowners a power over their serfs' lives that was terrifyingly close to absolute. A serf could not marry without the master's explicit permission. They could not leave the estate, even for a day. They could not own property of their own, nor could they file a complaint or seek legal recourse against their owner. An owner was their government, their law, and often their executioner. They could be bought, sold, and traded like sacks of grain. Families were routinely shattered on the casual whim of a master, with husbands, wives, and children sold to different estates hundreds of miles apart, destined never to see one another again. The quiet, constant terror of separation was a fundamental part of their existence. And while the law, on paper, technically forbade a landowner from murdering a serf, this was a rule so universally ignored as to be meaningless. The life of a serf was worth less than that of a prized hunting dog or a pedigreed horse. Beatings, floggings, and casual violence were not just common. They were an expected, daily feature of life, a tool of management and an expression of a master's mood. Life for a Russian serf was cheap, short, and relentlessly brutal. This was the world Darya Saltykova was born into in the year 1730. Her family was ancient, immensely wealthy, and deeply woven into the intricate tapestry of Moscow's ruling nobility. She received the standard education for a highborn woman of her time, which focused on making her a suitable wife and a capable manager of a household. From a young age, she was perceived as intensely, almost performatively, religious, an image she would cultivate and weaponize for her entire life. She was married off to a captain of the prestigious Imperial Guard, Gleb Saltykov, a man whose family was even more powerful and influential than her own. For a time, her life unfolded exactly as it was meant to. She was a countess, a devoted wife, and eventually a mother to 2 sons. During these years of her marriage, there were no outward signs of the profound darkness that lay dormant within her, no hint of the storm that was gathering just beneath the surface. But then, in 1755, the script of her life was violently torn apart. When Darya was just 26 years old, her husband, Gleb, died suddenly. His death was the catalyst, the single event that would unlock the cage and unleash a horror that would stain the annals of Russian history. As a widow, Darya Saltykova inherited a staggering fortune and several vast estates. And along with the land, the rubles, and the mansions, she inherited the absolute ownership of approximately 600 human beings. At 26, she was now one of the wealthiest and most powerful widows in Moscow. She answered to no one. Her family connections were impeccable, her wealth insulated her from scrutiny, and the law of the land gave her the power of life and death over hundreds of people. A society had already conditioned her to believe that these people were less than human. Any restraint her husband may have provided, any semblance of normalcy his presence enforced, was now gone. All that remained was a young woman with immeasurable wealth, total authority, and a mind that was about to fracture in the most terrifying way imaginable. The pious widow was about to begin her secret work, and the fields of her estate would soon be fertilized with blood. In the wake of her husband's death, Countess Saltykova did not retreat into private grief. Instead, she amplified her public persona, doubling down on the role that had served her so well. She leaned into the character of the grieving, devout widow with theatrical flair. Her donations to monasteries became more lavish, her pilgrimages to holy sites more conspicuous. Her reputation for piety became her most formidable weapon, a holy shield meticulously crafted to conceal the monster that was rapidly taking shape behind it. What precisely shattered within Darya Saltykova's mind is a question that haunts historians to this day. Was it a latent psychopathy, a dormant seed of cruelty that was finally given the perfect soil in which to grow? Did the intoxicating rush of absolute, unchecked power corrupt her so completely that it eroded her humanity? Or was it some unknowable, twisted cocktail of rage, sadism, and the sudden, terrifying freedom to act on her darkest impulses? Whatever the cause, the transformation was swift and catastrophic. Her reign of terror did not begin with a tidal wave of violence, but with a slow, creeping poison. The triggers for her rage were almost laughably mundane, a testament to the pettiness at the heart of her evil. A floor that was not washed to a perfect, reflective sheen. A dress that was not laundered to her impossible standards. A glance from a servant that she misinterpreted as defiant. These tiny, insignificant domestic failures would detonate a volcanic, all-consuming fury that was utterly disproportionate to the offense. At first, the punishments were beatings, a grimly common occurrence on noble estates. But from the very beginning, Saltykova's beatings were different. They were not intended to discipline or correct behavior. They were designed to maim, to break, to inflict the maximum possible agony. They were not swift acts of anger. They were sadistic, ritualistic exercises in cruelty that could drag on for hours. She would not merely order a servant to be whipped. She frequently took part herself, her noble hands gripping a heavy rod or a supple whip as she vented her rage directly onto the body of her victim. As the months bled into years, her cruelty began to mutate, to escalate into new and more terrifying forms. The beatings grew more severe, more prolonged. She began to keep implements of torture readily available throughout her mansion, heavy logs, stone rolling pins, and iron bars, always within reach for when her fury struck. Her male servants, particularly her guards and stable hands, were ordered to become her instruments, their grim duty to hold a victim down while the countess, or they on her command, beat the person, often until their heart gave out. A horrifying pattern began to emerge. Her rage was almost exclusively directed at the women and young girls who served her. Of the nearly 140 suspicious deaths eventually linked to her estate, only a handful were men. She seemed to possess a special, venomous hatred for the young women in her service, particularly girls as young as 10 or 12 years old. Soon, simple beatings were no longer enough to satisfy her cravings. She moved on to more creative, more diabolical forms of torture. Pouring boiling water from a steaming samovar over a victim's exposed skin became a favorite method. She was known to grab her victims by the hair, dragging them screaming across the floor, tearing out great clumps of their scalp in the process. At other times, she would use hot tongs, the kind used for styling hair or pressing fine linens, to burn her victims' faces and bodies, or she would take a candle and calmly, deliberately, set their hair on fire. Her country estate, Troitskoye, once a symbol of noble prosperity, became a house of horrors. The other serfs were trapped in a state of constant, paralyzing terror, knowing that any one of them, at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, could be next. In the early days, a few brave souls attempted to file complaints with the local authorities. But Saltykova's influence was a poison that had seeped into the very foundations of the justice system. She bribed local officials and clerks with ease. Any petition against her was mysteriously lost, or worse, the serf who dared to file it was arrested, publicly flogged for the crime of speaking against their mistress, and sent straight back to the Troitskoye estate to face her ultimate, final wrath. The message to the other serfs was unequivocal: there is no escape. There is no help. The system is designed to protect her, not you. For approximately 7 nightmarish years, from 1756 to 1762, Darya Saltykova operated with absolute impunity. Young women sent from the villages to work in the main house would simply disappear. When family members or the village elder dared to ask what had become of them, the excuse was always ready. The girl ran away. She was sent to a distant estate. She died of a sudden, tragic illness. Given the horrifically high mortality rate among serfs, these explanations were, for a time, accepted. But the sheer number of deaths, the sheer volume of missing girls, was becoming impossible to ignore. Her depravity became an open secret, a terrifying truth whispered in taverns and marketplaces. The local people, in their fear and hatred, gave her a new name. It was not Countess Saltykova. It was a monstrous, derogatory bastardization of her surname, a name that would become eternally synonymous with unparalleled cruelty, Saltychikha. The pious widow was gone, consumed by the monster she had become. In her place stood Saltychikha, the Ogress of Moscow, a predator hiding in plain sight. Inside the walls of the Troitskoye estate, life was not merely difficult, it was a waking nightmare. Darya Saltykova's cruelty was not a series of random outbursts. It had evolved into a systematic, daily reality. The very air in the manor was thick with a palpable dread. A dropped plate, a speck of dust on a mahogany table, a single crease in a freshly ironed shirt. Any of these tiny imperfections could be a death sentence. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was the silence of held breath, of prey listening for the footstep of the hunter. The stories that were later dragged into the light during the official investigation paint a picture of a mind utterly devoid of empathy, a bottomless pit of human cruelty. One of the most common torture rituals began with Saltykova's inspection of the floors. She would glide through the rooms, her eyes scanning for the slightest flaw. If she found one, a single smudge or a dull spot, her face would transform, and she would explode. Grabbing the nearest heavy object, a log from the fireplace, a heavy rolling pin from the kitchens, a metal bar used to lock a door, she would begin to beat the responsible girl mercilessly. These were not quick, angry swats. They were long, drawn-out affairs, methodical and relentless, designed to inflict maximum pain and terror, often continuing long after the victim had lost consciousness. The other servants were not just witnesses, they were forced to be her accomplices in this theater of pain. She rarely acted alone, preferring to command her sturdiest male guards and stable hands to hold a victim down, their own faces masks of terror as they participated in the destruction of one of their own. Sometimes, the beating was just the prelude. The half-conscious, Broken victim would then be dragged out into the courtyard for the next stage of the ordeal. In the brutal Russian winter, one of Saltykova's signature cruelties was put on full display. She would order a victim, often a young girl who had displeased her, to be stripped completely naked and left to stand in the snow, sometimes for hours, until she froze to death. Pregnancy offered no shield from her sadism. In fact, it seemed to bring out a special, unique kind of savagery in her. There are horrifying, stomach-churning accounts of her specifically targeting pregnant serf women. In one recorded case, kicking and stomping on a woman's abdomen until the unborn child was killed and the mother bled to death. Her sadistic imagination knew no bounds. She tore at her victims' ears with red-hot tongs, the smell of burning flesh filling the room. She would order a kettle of boiling water and pour it directly into their mouths and down their throats. The forensic descriptions of the bodies later exhumed by investigators were a catalog of pure horror. Flayed skin, limbs broken in multiple places, skulls crushed by repeated blows from a blunt object. One of the most tragic and horrifying stories to emerge from the estate was that of the serf Ermolai Aline. He had the horrific misfortune of losing not one, not two, but 3 wives to the Countess's bottomless rage. Each time he remarried, his new wife would be summoned to serve in the main house, and each time, she would be brutally murdered by Saltykova for some trivial offense. The first was beaten to death. The second was tortured and killed. The third met the same fate. This personal trilogy of horror, the experience of having 3 loves stolen from him by the same monstrous hand, finally broke something inside Aline. The fear that had paralyzed the entire estate for years was about to be shattered by an act of almost unimaginable courage, born from absolute despair. For all those years, Saltykova had gotten away with everything because the system was engineered for it. She was a Saltykov, a name that unlocked doors, bought silence, and closed investigations before they could even begin. Her immense wealth flowed freely into the pockets of anyone in local law enforcement who might think to cause her trouble. In her own mind, she was utterly convinced that she was above the law, because for all practical purposes, she was. The house was no longer a home. It was a charnel house, a private abattoir. It seemed her reign of terror was unstoppable, destined to continue until no one was left. But even the darkest night must eventually face the dawn, and the desperate cry of a man with nothing left to lose was about to travel all the way to the seat of the empire. If you are finding this exploration into the darkest chapters of human history compelling, and you wish to support our deep dives into the abyss, consider subscribing to History's Chronicles of Horror. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that serve as warnings from the past. Now, back to the nightmare at Troitskoye. For 7 long, blood-soaked years, the screams from the Troitskoye estate went unanswered, absorbed by the indifferent walls and the corrupt local bureaucracy. But in 1762, the political ground beneath Russia began to shift. A German princess, ambitious and fiercely intelligent, seized power in a masterful coup, deposing her own husband. She styled herself Catherine II, Empress of all Russia, the woman history would come to know as Catherine the Great. Catherine was a different kind of ruler. She saw herself not as a traditional Russian autocrat, but as a modern, enlightened monarch in the vein of the great Western European philosophers she so admired. She was determined to drag her vast, chaotic, and often barbaric empire into a new era. A central pillar of her ambitious agenda was a public campaign of lawfulness, a calculated effort to establish the rule of law and demonstrate that no one, not even the most powerful and blue-blooded nobles, was above the will of the empress. It was into this new, uncertain political climate that 2 serfs, Ermolai Aline and a companion named Savilii Martinov, decided to gamble with the only thing they had left, their lives. They were the men who had lost everything to Saltychikha's rage. With nothing left to lose, they undertook an act of breathtaking, near-suicidal courage. They fled the estate, becoming fugitives, and traveled hundreds of miles on foot to the new capital, St. Petersburg. Their goal was audacious: to deliver a petition detailing years of unspeakable horror directly into the hands of the Empress herself. Had they been caught at any point on their journey, they would have been arrested, brutally tortured, and inevitably killed. Somehow, against all odds, their desperate petition, a document filled with the names of the dead and descriptions of the atrocities, navigated the labyrinthine imperial bureaucracy, and landed on the desk of Catherine the Great. For the new empress, the Saltykova case was a golden opportunity, a political gift. Here was a perfect, grotesque symbol of the old, barbaric, and lawless Russia she was so eager to reform. By making a very public and very dramatic example of Saltykova, she could send a powerful, unambiguous message to the entire Russian nobility. A new era has dawned. The law applies to you too. Catherine acted decisively. She ordered the Collegium of Justice in Moscow, the highest legal authority in the old capital, to launch a full and exhaustive investigation. In 1762, officers arrived at the Troitskoy estate, and, to the utter shock of the entire Moscow aristocracy, Countess Darya Saltykova was arrested. She was stunned, disbelieving, utterly convinced that her powerful connections and vast fortune would save her, just as they always had. But this time was different. The order had not come from some bribeable local clerk. It had come directly from the Empress. The investigation that followed was unprecedented, lasting a full 6 years, from 1762 to 1768. Investigators descended upon the estate, determined to exhume every secret. They meticulously reviewed estate records, cross-referencing them with church burial logs. They noted the staggering, statistically impossible number of serfs reported as having died of illness or fled. They began digging up the grounds of the estate, and soon, their shovels struck bone. They unearthed the skeletal remains of dozens of victims from shallow, unmarked graves, the proof of murder hidden just beneath the soil. Most importantly, with Saltykova imprisoned and her power broken, the terrified silence that had shrouded the estate for years finally shattered. Investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses, serfs from Troitskoy and neighboring villages, priests, local officials, and even some of Saltykova's former henchmen, who now scrambled to save their own skins by testifying against their mistress. The stories poured out, a torrent of horror that shocked even the hardened investigators. The sheer scale of the crimes was stunning. The official list of suspicious deaths eventually reached 138 individuals. The evidence was irrefutable, overwhelming, and absolute. The pious widow was unmasked for all the world to see. The only question that remained for Empress Catherine was a complex one. How do you adequately punish such a monster in a country that had officially put a stop to the death penalty? In 1768, after a meticulous and harrowing 6-year investigation, the Imperial Collegium of Justice delivered its verdict. Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova was found guilty. The court officially confirmed that she had personally and sadistically tortured and murdered 38 women and young girls. While investigators had compiled a list of 138 suspicious deaths directly linked to her, proving every single case in a court of law, decades after the fact, and with evidence often buried, was an impossible task. Still, the confirmed number of 38 murders was more than enough. The trial was over. Her fate now rested entirely in the hands of Catherine the Great. This presented a delicate political problem for the Empress. The Russian public, now aware of the full scope of Saltychikha's atrocities, was horrified and baying for blood. They demanded vengeance. However, Catherine's predecessor, Empress Elizabeth, had issued a moratorium on the death penalty in 1754, a move seen as a step towards a more civilized Russia. For Catherine, who was still consolidating her power and desperately needed the aristocracy's support, to publicly execute a high-ranking noblewoman was a politically dangerous and potentially destabilizing move. Catherine required a punishment that was severe enough to satisfy the public's outrage, symbolic enough to serve as a stark warning to the nobility, and clever enough to avoid the political fallout of a formal execution. What she devised was nothing short of a masterpiece of political theater, a sentence meticulously designed to strip Saltykova of everything an aristocrat held dear: her name, her status, her wealth, her gender identity in the eyes of the state, and her very humanity. First came a ritual of profound public humiliation known as a civil execution. On a cold October day in 1768, Darya Saltykova was transported to Moscow's Red Square. She was chained to a specially constructed scaffold in the center of the square, where a massive crowd had gathered. They screamed and jeered at the woman who had terrorized them for years. Around her neck, a large placard was hung for all to read. It said, "This woman has tortured and murdered. For 1 hour she stood there, exposed to the hatred and disgust of the common people she had once viewed as less than insects. For a proud aristocrat like Saltykova, this public degradation was a fate worse than a swift death. Next, she was officially and permanently stripped of her noble title and all of her property and wealth, which was confiscated by the state. She was no longer Countess Saltykova. In the eyes of the law, she was now officially designated as a man, a bizarre legal stripping of her gender, and referred to only as the creature Saltykova. She had been rendered a non-person. The final part of her sentence was life imprisonment. But this would not be a comfortable confinement in a tower. Catherine ordered her to be taken to the Ivanovsky convent in Moscow and, for all intents and purposes, buried alive. Saltykova was placed in a penitential pit, a tiny, stone-lined cell dug into the convent cellar. There were no windows. There was no light. For 11 years, she lived in absolute, pitch-black solitary confinement. A single candle was lit only for the few moments it took to pass her food through a slot in the door. The darkness was total and unending. After more than a decade living in this abyss, her conditions were marginally eased. She was moved from the pit to a small stone cell that had a single, tiny, grated window that looked out onto the courtyard. By this point, her mind had reportedly completely shattered. It is said that she spent her final years screaming obscenities, spitting, and lunging at the curious onlookers who would peer through the grate, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous Saltychikha. She remained a prisoner in that convent for a total of 33 years. Darya Saltykova, the creature who was once a countess, died alone in her cell in 1801. She was a broken, insane, and forgotten old woman who, to her last breath, had never shown a single shred of remorse for her crimes. The trial and punishment of Saltychikha was a landmark event in the history of the Russian Empire. It was a bold and public declaration by Catherine the Great that the absolute, unchecked power of the nobility had limits, and that those limits were now being defined by the will of the Empress. It sent a tremor of fear through the aristocracy, a clear and undeniable warning that the worst of their traditional abuses would no longer be deliberately ignored by the crown. And while this one monster was caught and punished in a spectacular fashion, the system that created her was left firmly in place. The institution of serfdom, the very engine that had given Saltykova the power to kill with impunity, would continue to exist in Russia for nearly another century, until it was finally, belatedly abolished in 1861. The story of Saltychikha passed from news into legend, a dark and bloody folktale in Russian history, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the horrors of unchecked power and the darkness that can hide behind a pious mask. And it leaves us with an inescapable and disturbing thought. When we witness such monstrous acts, do we condemn the monster alone? Or do we dare to look at the society that gave her the power, the permission, and the protection to become one in the first place? Thank you for joining us at History's Chronicles of Horror. If you found this dive into one of history's darkest corners compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the moments where humanity confronted its own reflection in the abyss. Click the bell icon so you never miss a new exploration. We'll see you in the next chapter.